The sun had disappeared behind the jagged horizon, leaving the desert in a blanket of cold darkness. The woman stumbled along the rough terrain, her breath shallow, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. She had been wandering since dawn, desperate to find shelter, but the vast expanse offered nothing but sand, rocks, and the distant silhouette of twisted cacti. Each step became heavier than the last, and with every passing moment, the shadow of night seemed to close in on her. She knew that if she didn't find help soon, she wouldn't survive the night. In the distance, a lone figure emerged from the shadows, a man moving with calm, deliberate steps, carrying the aura of someone who belonged to the land rather than being defeated by it. He was an Apache, a solitary warrior whose eyes reflected the wisdom of the desert and the sharp awareness of a hunter. When he noticed the woman, curiosity mingled with caution. Strangers were rare in these parts, and survival instincts warned him to remain distant. She spotted him and, summoning the last ounce of her strength, called out, her voice hoarse and desperate, "If you don't take me, I won't last the night." Her plea was raw, filled with fear, yet carried a strange determination. The words pierced through the cool night air, reaching him in a way that could not be ignored. Despite his instinct to remain wary, he could sense the sincerity and urgency in her voice. There was no exaggeration, no theatrics, only survival. He approached cautiously, studying her condition. Her clothes were tattered and dust-stained, her skin flushed from heat and exhaustion. Her eyes, wide with vulnerability, met his with a silent plea that needed no explanation. He saw her fear, but he also saw courage, a fragile but undeniable spark of life that refused to surrender to despair. Though he rarely allowed anyone close, something about her compelled him to act. Without a word, he extended a hand to her. Hesitation flickered in her eyes, but relief soon replaced it. She grasped his hand, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip, the reassurance that she would not face the desert alone. He led her through a narrow canyon path, away from the exposed sand dunes where predators and cold could claim her. The journey was slow. She leaned on him, grateful for the support. Each step was a testament to her will to survive, and his quiet presence offered comfort she hadn't known she needed. As they reached a small, sheltered area, he began to set up a rudimentary camp. He gathered dry wood for a fire, arranging stones to shield it from the wind. The flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows across the rocks and illuminating the woman's weary face. She watched him silently, realizing that her life now depended on this stranger, someone she had never met, yet someone she had no choice but to trust. They sat near the fire, the warmth beginning to seep into her frozen body. The desert night was alive with sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of the wind over sand, the rustle of nocturnal creatures. He kept a watchful eye on the surroundings, his senses alert, while she slowly regained enough strength to speak. Between sips of water and small bites of food, their conversation began cautiously, words exchanged like careful steps over fragile ground. She spoke of her journey, omitting little details of danger and despair, while he listened quietly, offering no judgment, only presence. By the time the stars blanketed the sky, an unspoken understanding had begun to form between them. The woman realized that despite the danger of the world outside, she had found refuge in an unexpected place. And the Apache, though hesitant to admit it, felt a stirring of responsibility and connection that went beyond mere survival. The night had only begun, but the fragile thread of trust between them was already forming a thread that might become something far more powerful than either of them could yet imagine. The desert night deepened, and the air grew colder, sharp enough to bite through the thin layers of clothing the woman wore. She huddled closer to the fire, her hands cupped around the flickering warmth, feeling the life returning slowly to her frozen fingers. The Apache moved silently around the small camp, gathering more firewood and keeping watch on the shadowed terrain. Every crackle of the flames and every distant sound, the rustle of animals, the whisper of wind kept them alert. In this harsh wilderness, danger could come from anywhere, and neither could afford carelessness. The woman finally spoke, her voice small but determined. I don't even know your name," she said. Her words trembling not only from the cold but from vulnerability. She rarely allowed herself to show. The Apache paused, considering. "They call me Tayanita," he said quietly. "You?" She hesitated, then murmured her own name. Saying it aloud felt strange, almost intimate, as if naming herself in front of him made her real again. They fell silent, the night stretching between them like a living entity. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced across their faces, illuminating the lines of fatigue and worry. Suddenly, a distant howl pierced the desert stillness. Tayanita's gaze sharpened immediately, muscles tensing with instinct. The woman flinched, startled by the rawness of the sound, her fear rekindled. "What was that?" she whispered. "Coyotes," he replied calmly, but with an edge of warning. "They hunt in packs at night. But if we stay close to the fire, we'll be safe." His voice was steady, a pillar in the chaos of the desert's nocturnal symphony. She nodded, trusting him even though she had only just met him. As the night progressed, he noticed her shivering despite the fire. Without a word, he removed his own outer garment and draped it around her shoulders. She resisted at first, embarrassed by the gesture, but the warmth enveloped her, soothing the raw cold and unease. The simple act, though unspoken, conveyed protection and care. She realized for the first time in a long while that she wasn't entirely alone. Tayanita's thoughts wandered as he observed her. She was not the fragile, helpless figure he initially assumed. There was resilience beneath her fear, a quiet determination that mirrored his own survival instincts. Yet, there was more than that. Her presence awakened a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years, not even for those in his own tribe. Something about the urgency in her plea, the raw honesty of her desperation, stirred feelings he was unaccustomed to addressing. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to weigh on both of them. The woman's eyelids drooped, and she rested her head against a rock, trusting the Apache to watch over her. Tayanita remained vigilant, eyes scanning the darkness, listening to every whisper of the wind, every tiny movement. He knew the desert could be unforgiving, but in that moment, the thought of losing her was unbearable. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, the night's tension began to ebb, leaving behind a fragile sense of calm. The fire was reduced to embers, yet the bond between them had strengthened. Through shared vulnerability, fear, and survival, an unspoken connection had formed. The woman, who had entered the night trembling and desperate, now felt a flicker of hope and trust she hadn't experienced in years. And the Apache, solitary and cautious, realized that this encounter born from urgency and necessity had left a mark deeper than he expected. Though the night had been long and perilous, it had also been transformative. They had faced the desert's dangers together, and in doing so, had discovered an unexpected kinship, one built on survival, trust, and a burgeoning awareness that perhaps, against all odds, the harsh wilderness was capable of forging human connection. If you want, I can continue with part 3, where external threats intensify and their relationship begins to. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert in muted shades of gold and pink. The night's cold had given way to the harsh warmth of the early sun, but the woman remained weary, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the rocky ground. The Apache, Tayanita, stirred beside her, scanning the horizon as he always did. Even in the light of day, danger was never far in this unforgiving landscape. He had survived countless nights alone, yet something about having her near made him more alert, more protective than usual. The woman slowly sat up, brushing sand and dust from her clothes. Her gratitude for the previous night's shelter bubbled quietly inside her. She glanced at Tayanita, hesitant to speak, but needing to acknowledge the unspoken bond that had formed. "Thank you for saving me," she murmured. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but it carried sincerity that touched him. Tayanita nodded briefly, not one to indulge in long explanations or expressions of sentiment. His eyes, however, betrayed a depth of thought. He observed her with a mixture of caution and curiosity, noting how the desert had already begun to change her posture, her confidence, albeit subtly. She had survived the night not just physically but emotionally, leaning on him without shame or complaint. They began their trek across the desert together, moving cautiously toward a distant ridge that promised shelter and water. Every step was measured, mindful of loose stones and hidden dangers. Along the way, she asked questions, softly, hesitantly, about the land, about his life as an Apache warrior. At first, Tayanita answered minimally, cautious of revealing too much to a stranger. But as hours passed, the monotony of the journey and the quiet companionship softened his guard. He shared glimpses of his life, the lessons taught by his elders, the solitude he had embraced, and the responsibilities that weighed on him. The woman listened, enraptured not just by the stories but by the man himself. He was strong, capable, and unyielding, yet there was a kindness beneath his exterior, a quiet code of honor that she admired. As the sun rose higher, they found a shallow stream trickling between rocks, a rare gift in the desert. Tayanita knelt to drink, offering water to her with a nod. She cupped her hands, drinking eagerly, feeling the cool liquid rejuvenate her exhausted body. But safety was fleeting. A sudden rustle in the nearby bush made Tayanita's hand fly to the small knife at his belt. His senses sharpened instantly. The woman froze, fear lacing her features. A coyote, startled by their presence, bounded out of the undergrowth and disappeared into the scrub. The tension dissipated, but the woman realized just how fragile their safety truly was. Tayanita looked at her, his gaze steady. "The desert doesn't forgive weakness," he said simply. She nodded, understanding both the literal and metaphorical weight of his words. Survival demanded courage, vigilance, and trust both in oneself and in others. As the day wore on, the desert became oppressive, the sun beating down on them relentlessly. Yet, through shared struggle, a rhythm of companionship emerged. They exchanged small smiles, brief conversations, and gestures of mutual respect. He adjusted her clothing against the sun, and she helped carry a small pack he had brought. The unspoken trust between them grew stronger with every step, a fragile bond solidifying into something neither expected but both acknowledged. By late afternoon, they reached a rocky outcrop that offered shade and a vantage point over the surrounding terrain. Exhausted but alive, they settled down, sharing a quiet meal and reflecting on the events of the past night. The woman realized that her desperation had led her not only to survival, but to a man who embodied both strength and compassion. Tayanita, in turn, felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar concern that went beyond mere survival, an awareness that this woman had changed the solitude he had always taken for granted. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh yet beautiful. And as they rested, both understood that their journey was far from over. The night had tested them, the day had bonded them, and the coming days would demand even more physically, emotionally, and perhaps, if fate allowed, even spiritually. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The heat that had pressed down on them all day began to wane, leaving a cooler, more bearable warmth. The woman leaned against a sun-warmed rock, wiping sweat from her brow, while Tayanita continued scanning the horizon. His instincts remained sharp, every movement purposeful, yet his attention occasionally drifted toward her. He noticed the subtle weariness in her stance, the way her eyes followed him with quiet curiosity, and the small, unspoken gestures she made that revealed her growing trust. They continued their trek, the desert landscape gradually shifting from barren sands to sparse vegetation. Every step was a careful negotiation with the harsh terrain. Loose rocks, prickly shrubs, and the occasional scuttling creature reminded them that survival required constant awareness. But beneath the physical struggle, a subtler tension began to form. The night of desperation had sparked a connection. The long day of shared effort was deepening it. And now, in these quieter moments, unspoken emotions lingered in the space between them. The woman finally broke the silence. "You seem different from anyone I've ever met," she said softly, almost hesitantly. Her voice carried both admiration and a trace of awe. Tyanita didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the horizon, yet his mind turned over her words. "Different?" he finally said, his tone calm but measured. "Yes," she replied, looking down at the ground. "Strong and careful. Like you don't trust easily, but when you do, it matters." Her words were simple, yet they struck a chord. Tyanita's jaw tightened slightly, an internal acknowledgement that she had seen him in a way few ever had done as they moved onward. A sudden rustling in the brush snapped their attention to immediate danger. A small group of scavenging desert predators, wolves or coyotes emerged from the shadows, drawn by the scent of movement and warmth. Instantly, Tyanita's protective instinct surged. He stepped in front of her, positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. The woman froze for a moment, heart pounding, but then instinctively mirrored his stance, grabbing a sturdy stick to defend herself. The standoff was tense but brief. Tyanita's commanding presence and swift movements sent the predator scattering back into the brush. The woman exhaled shakily, her fear mixing with adrenaline. I can't believe you saved me again," she whispered, her voice trembling but filled with awe. He turned to her, a faint shadow of a smile brushing his lips, though his eyes remained serious. "You've survived this far," he said quietly. "Don't underestimate yourself." Her chest swelled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She realized that she was beginning to admire him not just for his strength, but for the way he had made her feel safe, even in the most perilous situations. They pressed on until they reached a natural alcove, among the rocks a perfect shelter for the night. Tyanita quickly set up a small camp, lighting a fire and gathering nearby brush. The woman assisted, her movements more confident now, showing him that she was learning, adapting, and capable of more than mere survival. As the fire crackled, they shared quiet glances and small gestures, a hand brushing against another while passing water, a shared look over the flames that lingered just a second too long. Night fell, and with it, a silence that was heavy with anticipation. The desert around them was alive with nocturnal sounds, the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind over the rocks, but inside their small camp, a subtler tension simmered. Words were no longer needed to communicate the growing connection between them. She trusted him completely. He, in turn, felt a protective instinct that went far beyond survival. As the fire burned low, they settled close together for warmth. Neither spoke for a long moment, each aware of the fragile intimacy that had grown between them. The night promised danger, but also the beginning of something far more profound, a bond forged in desperation, solidified through survival, and slowly transforming into the unspoken stirrings of affection. The desert night wrapped around them like a heavy blanket, cold and unyielding, but the fire Tyanita had built offered a small island of warmth. The woman huddled close, feeling the residual heat against her chilled skin, and for the first time since she had wandered into the desert, she felt something approaching safety, not just physically, but emotionally. She stole a glance at Tyanita, noticing the sharp lines of his face softened by the flickering firelight. His vigilant eyes now relaxed slightly as he allowed himself a moment of quiet. The silence between them was comfortable, almost intimate, a stark contrast to the tension of the previous nights. She reached out instinctively, brushing a stray wisp of hair from her face, and he caught the motion with his own hand, holding it gently for a brief moment. The contact was fleeting but electrifying, sending a shiver down her spine. She looked away quickly, heart racing, aware that this was a line neither of them had crossed before, but the night had a way of bending boundaries. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and uncertain. "I never thought I'd survive this desert alone, and yet, here I am." Her words were more than just about survival. They carried gratitude, awe, and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Tyanita's gaze softened. "You are stronger than you think," he said quietly. "The desert doesn't spare the weak, and yet you've made it this far. That says more than words ever could." His compliment was understated, but it carried weight. The woman felt a warmth blossom in her chest, not just from the fire, but from his recognition of her resilience. The night deepened, and with it came the sounds of the desert, distant howls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, and the wind whispering across the rocks. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the brush, a warning sign of predators nearby. Tyanita's posture stiffened, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. He moved instinctively between her and the noise, signaling for her to stay low. Heart pounding, she crouched beside him, adrenaline flooding her system. A coyote emerged from the shadows, drawn by scent and movement, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Tyanita's movements were fluid and precise, and with a commanding gesture, he sent the animal retreating back into the night. She exhaled shakily, relief mingled with awe. "You saved me again," she whispered, voice trembling with gratitude. "You've helped yourself too," he replied, his tone calm but edged with seriousness. "You've learned to trust your instincts. That's why you're still here." His words resonated deeply with her, making her realize that her journey was not only about survival, but about discovering her own strength. As the night grew quieter, Tyanita moved closer, sharing his blanket to ward off the cold. She accepted silently, their bodies almost touching, the closeness igniting a subtle, unspoken tension between them. Neither spoke. The connection between them spoke volumes, each glance, each brush of a hand reinforcing the fragile intimacy that had grown over the past nights. Finally, exhaustion overtook them. She rested her head lightly on the fire-warmed rocks, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing nearby. The desert around them remained harsh and unpredictable, but within the small circle of firelight, they had carved out a space of safety, trust, and something far more profound. The first tender threads of affection. The night would bring more challenges. Of that they were both aware, but for now, they allowed themselves this fragile reprieve. The desert had tested them, shaped them, and in the process, had drawn two souls together who might never have crossed paths under ordinary circumstances. As sleep began to claim her, she realized that Tyanita had become more than a protector. He had become a presence she relied on, trusted, and perhaps would not want to be without. The sun had barely risen when the desert stirred with a quiet intensity, the light revealing jagged rocks, twisted cacti, and the endless expanse of sand. The previous night's cold had faded, replaced by the heat of early morning, yet the firelight memory lingered between the woman and Tyanita. They had survived another night, their bond deepened by shared hardship and unspoken trust. But the desert was not forgiving, and Tyanita knew they could not linger for long. The woman stretched, her body still sore from the night's cramped position, but her spirit felt renewed. There was a sense of strength within her now, born from surviving the darkness with Tyanita by her side. She watched him as he packed their minimal belongings, his movements precise and deliberate. Every gesture carried purpose, a silent testament to years of survival and experience. She admired him more than she could express, not just for his skill, but for the quiet strength and protection he offered so naturally. "Where are we going?" she asked cautiously, careful not to break the rhythm of their journey. Tayanita glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "There is a canyon ahead," he said simply. "Water and shelter. But we must move carefully. There are others in these parts who would not welcome strangers." His words carried a warning that made her pulse quicken. The desert was as dangerous from human threats as it was from the elements, and she realized that survival required constant vigilance. They set off, moving swiftly yet silently across the dunes. The woman followed his lead, learning to read the subtle signs of the terrain-disturbed sand, broken branches, distant tracks. Tayanita noticed her attentiveness and resilience, a rare spark of pride flickering in his eyes. She was no longer the fragile figure he had found days ago. She was becoming someone capable, adaptable, and courageous. As the sun climbed higher, a sudden movement caught Tayanita's attention. Figures emerged from the brush, a small band of hostile men, clearly tracking or hunting them. His instincts flared, and without hesitation, he pulled the woman behind a rocky outcrop, shielding her with his body. Heart racing, she realized the danger was far more immediate than the desert's natural threats. "They won't hesitate," he whispered, eyes scanning for escape routes. "We need to move quietly and fast," she nodded, trusting his judgment completely, her fear tempered by the confidence he instilled in her. Together, they slipped through narrow passages, the woman's steps guided by Tayanita's experience and the lessons of survival he had imparted. Hours later, they reached the mouth of a hidden canyon. A small stream trickled through rocks, surrounded by shade and sparse vegetation, a sanctuary carved by nature. They paused, catching their breath, the tension of pursuit still lingering. The woman looked at Tayanita, realizing the full extent of what he had done for her, not just saving her from the night, but protecting her from human threats she could neither anticipate nor defend against. Gratitude, awe, and a quiet affection swelled within her. Tayanita, meanwhile, observed her closely. She was no longer the desperate, pleading figure who had first stumbled into the desert. She had become someone resilient, capable, and remarkably brave. Yet he also felt something he hadn't anticipated, a protective instinct that bordered on something deeper, something he had long denied himself. The thought of losing her, even in this harsh, unforgiving land, stirred feelings he could not easily dismiss. That evening, as they settled near the stream, Tayanita built a fire while the woman gathered small bundles of dry brush. Their movements were synchronized, comfortable, and intimate in ways neither fully acknowledged. Sitting together by the fire, sharing the warmth and silence, they allowed themselves a brief moment of respite. The night promised challenges, yes, but it also promised connection, trust, and a bond forged through survival, courage, and the subtle stirrings of something neither dared to name yet. In the quiet of the canyon, beneath the stars beginning to emerge, both understood that the desert had tested them, and in its trials, it had begun to transform them. The dangers were far from over, but so too was the bond that had begun to grow between them, fragile yet undeniable, and with every passing moment, impossible to ignore. The desert night fell quietly, yet the air was thick with anticipation. The canyon offered shelter, but the wilderness beyond remained unpredictable, and both the woman and Tayanita knew that the fragile safety they had found could vanish in an instant. They sat close to the fire, the flames casting long, flickering shadows on the rocks around them. The woman's hands hovered near the warmth, but she noticed that she kept inching slightly closer to him, drawn by more than just the heat. "Do you think we'll be safe here?" she asked, her voice hesitant but tinged with curiosity. Tayanita's eyes scanned the canyon's entrance, sharp and alert even in the dim light. "For now," he replied quietly. "But the desert has ways of reminding you that nothing lasts forever." His tone was calm, yet there was an underlying intensity that made her realize he wasn't speaking merely about the physical dangers outside. They were also speaking of the fragile trust and bond growing between them. The woman's gaze met his, and for the first time since he had taken her in, she dared to study him without fear. His face, strong and weathered, revealed a complexity she hadn't anticipated, a sense of duty, patience, and even vulnerability hidden beneath the warrior's exterior. She realized that the man who had rescued her, guided her, and protected her from the harsh elements was slowly becoming someone she admired and perhaps something more. Tayanita, meanwhile, noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She was no longer merely desperate or pleading. She had begun to carry herself with quiet confidence. Every glance she gave, every careful movement, spoke of resilience and courage. And yet, beneath that growing strength, he detected moments of vulnerability, moments that made him want to shield her even more fiercely than before. As the night deepened, the wind rustled through the canyon, carrying with it the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Tayanita built the fire higher, the warmth casting a comforting glow. The woman offered to help, gathering more dry brush. Their hands brushed briefly as they worked, and the contact lingered longer than necessary. A spark of awareness passed between them, an acknowledgement of the tension, the connection, the subtle pull that neither could yet name. Once the fire burned steadily, they settled down together, leaning against the rocks. Silence stretched comfortably, broken only by the occasional crackle of flames. The woman let her head rest lightly on her knees, watching Tayanita as he kept an eye on the canyon entrance. He noticed her gaze and gave her a fleeting, gentle smile, one that conveyed reassurance and something deeper, a recognition of the trust she had placed in him, and perhaps an unspoken acknowledgement of the growing closeness between them. She swallowed hard, realizing her own heartbeat had accelerated. Her emotions were a mix of gratitude, admiration, and something she could not yet define. He had become her protector, her guide, her lifeline in this merciless landscape, but now, unexpectedly, he was also someone she was beginning to care about in ways that transcended survival. Tayanita's thoughts mirrored hers, though he would not admit it aloud. He felt a strange but undeniable attachment to her, a desire to protect her beyond necessity, a concern that had nothing to do with the desert and everything to do with the woman herself. Her presence had begun to awaken feelings he had long kept buried: companionship, affection, and the beginnings of something fragile and powerful. Night stretched on, and as the stars emerged overhead, both remained awake, bound by circumstance, trust, and the subtle stirrings of attraction. The canyon, the fire, and the desert around them had become the crucible for their connection. Danger still lurked outside, but inside their small circle of light, a new kind of warmth had begun to grow, one born of shared survival, growing trust, and the quiet promise of something neither of them had dared to voice. The morning sun broke over the canyon walls, spilling gold and amber across the rocks and sand. The desert, though beautiful, offered no respite from its harsh realities. Tayanita and the woman, now traveling together with an unspoken understanding, rose quietly, gathering their small belongings. The night had been long but uneventful, yet both knew that danger could appear at any moment. Their vigilance was instinct, a necessity born from days of surviving the wilderness together. As they moved through the narrow canyon path, the woman noticed how naturally Tayanita led their journey. He moved silently yet decisively, scanning the terrain and noting every sign of wildlife or potential threats. She followed closely, her confidence growing with each step. She was no longer the helpless figure who had stumbled into the desert days ago. She was learning to survive, to anticipate, and to trust her instincts, often guided by him, but increasingly guided by her own growing awareness. Suddenly, movement in the brush caught their attention. Tayanita froze, signaling her to stay low. A small band of men emerged, armed and clearly hostile. They had been tracking the pair, likely drawn by the knowledge that someone new had entered this harsh territory. Tayanita's protective instincts surged immediately. He positioned himself between the woman and the threat, silently gesturing for her to follow his lead. The woman's heart pounded, yet she didn't falter. She mirrored his movements, crouching low, keeping behind rocks, and learning the subtle art of concealment. The tension between them was palpable, not just from the immediate danger, but from the shared reliance that had developed over the past nights. They moved as a unit, their trust in one another becoming as vital as the survival skills that Tayanita had taught her. The hostile men closed in, but Tayanita's knowledge of the terrain gave them an edge. Using narrow passages and rocky outcrops, he guided them silently away from the path of the pursuers. The woman's hands brushed against his more than once, accidental touches that carried warmth and reassurance. She felt a flutter of emotions she hadn't expected: fear, adrenaline, and a growing sense of closeness. Each moment of contact, each shared glance, was becoming charged with unspoken meaning. Once they were safely hidden behind a large rock formation, Tayanita paused, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. He turned to the woman, his expression softer now that the immediate threat had passed. "You're learning fast," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. His words carried admiration, and the woman felt a rush of pride and warmth at his acknowledgement. She smiled faintly, feeling the connection between them deepen. "I had a good teacher," she replied softly, glancing at him with a mixture of gratitude and something more. Recognition of the bond that had grown beyond mere survival. They moved cautiously for the rest of the day, keeping to shaded areas and rocky paths. The woman could feel the subtle tension between them close enough to notice, too real to ignore. Each glance lingered a moment too long. Each brush of a hand carried unspoken emotion. The desert had stripped away all pretenses, leaving them with only their instincts, their courage, and the fragile, growing bond that connected them. By late afternoon, they found a secluded alcove with a small stream and patches of shade. They set up camp again, tired but alive. The women worked to gather firewood while Tayanita kept watch, their movements complementary and intuitive. The fire they built cast warm light across their faces, and for the first time, the woman felt a sense of peace that went beyond survival, a connection that spoke of trust, care, and the first whispers of attraction neither had dared to name. As the stars began to emerge above the canyon walls, the night promised both challenge and closeness. The desert remained unpredictable, but within the safety of their small camp, the bond between them was undeniable. They had survived the wilderness together, and now something deeper was beginning to take root, a fragile, unspoken intimacy, tempered by danger, trust, and the quiet understanding that they could rely on each other in a world that often offered no mercy. The desert night stretched around them like an endless sea of darkness, broken only by the flickering glow of their fire. The canyon, though providing shelter, felt alive with unseen dangers, the subtle rustle of small creatures, the distant howls of predators, and the ever-present wind whispering through the rocks. The woman sat close to Tayanita, her body seeking warmth, but her mind was alive with thoughts and emotions she had not anticipated. "You've been quiet," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice carried a hint of curiosity and a trace of vulnerability. Tayanita's eyes, focused on the shadows at the canyon's mouth, flicked toward her. "Quiet?" he repeated, his tone low, cautious. "Yes," she murmured. You think, you observe, but you rarely speak. I want to know you." The words were simple, yet they held a courage that had grown steadily over their days together. He looked at her, noting how her eyes searched his, not just for answers, but for understanding, for connection. Tayanita exhaled slowly, a subtle sign of opening. "I speak when it matters," he said, his voice steady, almost a whisper. "Some things are better shown than said." His gaze softened as he glanced at her, and for the first time she saw the depth beneath his guarded exterior, a man shaped by hardship, yet capable of care, patience, and quiet affection. The woman's heart stirred. She realized she was no longer just dependent on him for survival. She felt a growing attachment, a bond forged through nights of danger, days of shared struggle, and moments of subtle, unspoken intimacy. Every brush of a hand, every protective glance, every shared look around the fire had begun to weave an invisible thread between them. Suddenly, a sharp movement in the shadows snapped them both to attention. A lone predator, a coyote, drawn by the smell of warmth and food, emerged from the canyon's edge. Tayanita's hand went instinctively to his knife, and his body shifted to shield her. Her heart pounded, yet she followed his lead, crouching low behind a rock. The predator circled, cautious, but Tayanita's presence and quiet authority sent it retreating into the darkness. The woman exhaled shakily, and he glanced at her, a faint smile brushing his lips. "You're learning quickly," he said, and in that moment she felt the warmth of pride and approval deepen her attachment. She realized that she had not only survived, but had begun to thrive under his guidance, and the admiration in his tone stirred emotions she had long buried. As the night wore on, they shared small moments of intimacy. She brought him water, their hands brushing lightly. He adjusted her clothing against the chill, lingering just slightly longer than necessary. Each subtle contact, each silent acknowledgement, carried unspoken meaning. The desert had forced them into reliance on one another, and now it was shaping something far more profound: trust, affection, and the beginnings of emotional connection. Eventually, they settled closer to the fire, sharing warmth and silence. The woman's head rested lightly on her knees, but she could feel the subtle presence of Tayanita nearby, alert, protective, yet strangely comforting. She realized that she had come to depend not just on his skill and strength, but on his presence itself. Tayanita, too, felt the shift within himself. He had spent years alone, guarding his heart against attachment. Yet she had awakened something he could not ignore, a protective instinct that went beyond survival, an appreciation for her courage, and an unspoken attraction that grew stronger with every passing moment. The night deepened, stars emerging overhead in their brilliant clarity, and with it came the quiet understanding. Their connection was no longer merely about survival. It had become something far more complex: trust intertwined with admiration, respect blended with subtle desire, and a fragile intimacy forged in the crucible of the desert. In the quiet of the canyon, both knew that the challenges ahead would test them further, but for now, they allowed themselves a fleeting moment of closeness, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown stronger with each shared danger, each night survived, and each quiet glance by the fire. The desert was alive with tension as the last rays of the sun slipped behind the canyon walls, leaving the landscape bathed in shadow. Tayanita and the woman moved cautiously along a narrow path, aware that danger could strike from any direction. The events of the previous days had sharpened their senses and strengthened their bond, but nothing could prepare them for the threat now looming ahead. Suddenly, movement erupted from the brush. A band of men, larger and more organized than before, emerged, clearly hunting them. Tayanita immediately positioned himself between the woman and the attackers, his stance firm, knife in hand. She felt her heart race, but this time fear was tempered by the confidence he had instilled in her. She mirrored his movements, ready to act, her trust in him absolute. "You stay close to me," Tianita whispered, his voice low but commanding. She nodded, feeling the weight of his protection and the unspoken intimacy in his tone. The men approached, unaware that the desert had already given the pair advantages: knowledge of the terrain, hidden paths, and an instinctive synchronization born of shared survival. As the attackers closed in, Tianita and the woman darted between rocks and shadows, leading them on a chase that played to their strengths. She moved with surprising agility, guided by his whispered instructions, while he shielded her from sight and danger. Their hands brushed repeatedly in moments of necessity, each contact reinforcing the bond that had quietly grown over the past nights. Confrontation reached its climax at a narrow cliffside. Tianita turned to face the remaining men, positioning the woman behind him. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that gaze she saw not just protection, but trust, understanding, and a connection that went beyond words. "Stay here," he commanded softly. She remained still, heart pounding, but with a newfound courage rooted in the trust between them. The attackers advanced, but Tianita's mastery of the terrain gave him the upper hand. With swift, precise movements, he incapacitated the men one by one, using rocks, strategic positioning, and his knife. The woman watched in awe, heart swelling with admiration and an undeniable emotional surge. The danger, while terrifying, only strengthened the connection between them. They were no longer merely protector and dependent, but partners forged in the crucible of survival. When the last of the attackers fled, defeated and frightened, Tianita exhaled deeply and turned toward the woman. Relief washed over them both. She ran to him instinctively, throwing her arms around his waist, and he held her close, feeling the warmth of her body and the beat of her heart against his. For a moment, words were unnecessary. The fire of survival, trust, and shared peril had ignited a deeper flame between them. I thought I might lose you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Tianita's gaze softened, and he rested his forehead against hers. "You'll never be alone as long as I'm here," he replied quietly. The desert around them was harsh and unforgiving, yet in that moment it had become a witness to a bond stronger than fear, danger, or isolation. Night fell fully, and they settled beside the fire they rekindled together, the warmth now symbolic of more than survival. It was a warmth of trust, companionship, and the unspoken beginnings of love. The desert had tested them relentlessly, but it had also revealed their strength, resilience, and the profound connection that had grown in the midst of adversity. As the stars glimmered above, they sat side by side, no longer simply survivor and protector, but equals bound by experience, courage, and the quiet stirrings of a romance born in the harshest of places. In the desert's unforgiving wilderness, they had found something rare and extraordinary: each other.